Thank you all so much for joining us to celebrate Surviving Southampton, African American Women and Resistance in Nat Turner's Community. My name is Heather, and I'm the Publicity Manager at the University of Illinois Press, and I'm just going to go over some brief logistical information and introduce our guests before we get started. First of all, thank you so much to Dr. Holden and Dr. Dunbar for being here today. They're going to talk for about 40 minutes, and then we will have time for a 20-minute Q&A at the end. You can enter questions throughout the event by clicking the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. You can use promo code Holden40 to get a 40% discount on the book on the University of Illinois Press website. I'll put the promo code and a link to the book in the chat box. We will also be recording the event and posting it on our YouTube channel afterwards. You'll receive an email from Zoom after the event that will have both the discount code and a link to our YouTube channel as well. And now I will just briefly introduce our guests. Dr. Vanessa M Holden is an Associate Professor of History and African American and Africana Studies at the University of Kentucky. She is also the Director of the Central Kentucky Slavery Initiative at the University of Kentucky. Dr. Holden's book, Surviving Southampton, African American Women and Resistance in Nat Turner's Community, explores the contributions that African American women and children made to the Southampton Rebellion, often called Nat Turner's Rebellion. Her writing has been published in Slavery and Abolition, a journal of slave and post-slave studies, Perspectives on History, Process, a blog for American history, and The Rumpus. Dr. Holden also co-convenes the hashtag Slavery Archive Book Club with co-founders Dr. Johnson and Dr. Ana Lucia Arajo and co-convener Dr. Alex Gill. Dr. Holden serves as a faculty advisor on a number of public history and digital humanities projects, including Freedom on the Move and The Chronicle of African Americans in the Horse Industry. You can follow her on Twitter at Dr. B. Holden. Dr. Erica Armstrong Dunbar is the Charles and Mary Beard Distinguished Professor of History at Rutgers University. She currently serves as the National Director of the Association of Black Women Historians, the only professional organization focused on Black women's history. Dunbar's first book, A Fragile Freedom, African American Women and Emancipation in the Antebellum City, was published by Yale University Press in 2008. Her second book, Never Caught, The Washington's Relentless Pursuit of Their Runaway Slave, Ona Judge, published by Simon & Schuster, was a finalist for the National Book Award in Nonfiction and a winner of the 2018 Frederick Douglass Book Prize. The Young Reader's version of Never Caught was published in January 2019. In the fall of 2019, Dunbar published She Came to Slay, The Life and Times of Harriet Tubman, an accessible biography of one of the most remarkable social activists of the 19th century. Dunbar's op-eds in outlets such as the New York Times, The Nation, Time, Essence, and the Philadelphia Inquirer, her commentary in media outlets such as CNN and the LA Times, and her appearances in documentaries such as The Abolitionists, an American Experience production on PBS, the History Channel's biopic of George Washington, as well as Kareem Abdul-Jabbar's Black Patriots, place her at the center of America's public history. You can follow her on Twitter at Erica A. Dunbar. And now, without further ado, I will turn it over to Dr. Holden and Dr. Dunbar. Thanks again to everyone for being here today.
Well, I am absolutely thrilled to be here. I'm going to start by saying happy book birthday, right?
Thank you.
Happy book birthday. And to hold your book, to look at your book, to read your book, is so exciting, so important. And I'll begin with just saying that I've seen this book, it sort of move along in different stages. And it is such a pleasure, but also I'm excited just about the importance of this book, where it will sit in the field, and the contribution that you've offered to all of us by writing this book and offering it to us today. So I'll start with a thank you and a congratulations.
Thank you.
And then, I think that the idea is for us to be in conversation with each other about this masterpiece, and then to have a little bit of Q&A for all of the folks who I see who've joined us and are shouting you out right now in the chat and congratulating you. So I'm just gonna start with asking you the real sort of, tell us how you came to this project? Give us the kind of origin story of this book.
When I was a kid, my mom placed a really high priority on making sure that her kids had a really full education and appreciated lifelong learning. And so she would take us on field trips, even if the school, didn't really have the money to do it or wasn't doing it. And we went to Mount Vernon when I was in about 5th grade. And I was so excited to see the first president's house because I was a history nerd, even as a child. And we stumbled upon, it was not included on the tour, but we stumbled upon a graveyard and a marker for the enslaved people who were interned there. And I remember asking her that day, whoa, clarification. Did George Washington have slaves? And she said, yes, he did. And I had so many questions that I had to supplement my own reading because school wasn't really talking about it. And when I got to college, I fell absolutely in love with the history of the state of Virginia, the Commonwealth of Virginia. Because there's so much there in that particular place's history that explains so much about everywhere else in the country. I remember reading the Confessions of Nat Turner in a history course in college. And of course, there were all the critiques that it's heavily mediated, it was written down by a white author. And I zeroed in on the part where Turner talked about being a fugitive in the local woods for months after this rebellion. And my first question was, who fed Nat Turner? Because he wasn't hunting himself. He couldn't risk capture. Who fed him? And even after over a decade of research, I can't give you one single name. But I could give you the story of a community that already had systems in place to keep people alive. And so that's really how I came to survival. I zoomed in on, wait a second, how do you survive a slave rebellion? Not how do you launch one. That's fairly matter of fact, how you launch a slave rebellion. But how do you survive in the wake of a rebellion?
What does it look like on the ground afterwards? And I think that's one of the things that you take us through so beautifully. I'm gonna back up a little bit before I sort of ask you some more kind of focused questions about the book. A sip from the mug, please, for everyone to see. I'm gonna ask you to really, one of the important things I think about this book is that you show us what we can do methodologically when we are studying the lives of enslaved people, when we may have fragmented archives, if we have archives at all. And so I'm hoping you could talk a little bit about your methodological process in the shaping and the fashioning of this book.
Yeah, I gave a seminar at one point, and I had an archivist show up, and afterwards shook my hand and said, I just decided to show up today because I couldn't believe you could do this. And I said, oh, okay. Mm-hmm. So here's the thing. I remember asking over and over throughout my education, what about Black women? What about Black women's history? And was met at every turn with, well, we just can't know. We just can't know Black people's history. We just can't know. We can speak in generalizations. We can talk about important laws that were passed, but we just can't know. And I knew from my own experience growing up as a Black Latina woman that we know. So I thought to myself, well, we just got to go find ourselves somewhere in here because we know this story. And I opened the book actually with a family story that was passed down about surviving this rebellion and the grief that came with losing people in this rebellion. And that's the mindset with which I encountered silence in the archive. I'm a scholar who really believes you need to trust silence because silence saves lives. That sometimes people are silenced, and that is very important to acknowledge. But I've read through so many court transcripts, and I know where these people physically were during the rebellion. And I'm clear that they answered what they were asked and nothing else. So a lot of what I do is look at the sources that people have been looking at for a very long time about America's most famous slave rebellion. But I ask, where would women have been on this day? Where would children have been? Where are free people of color? And the answer is they were all there in the courthouse, on the grounds around the court. They were all there. Many of them speak up. Now, they didn't have much choice about speaking up, but they speak up in court. And they were in important places. They were in kitchens where people were murdered. They were in front yards where people were slain. And they don't give anybody up. In Turner's Confessions, he does not name a single person who had not already been convicted and or executed. Silence saves lives. So I lean right on in to that silence, sort of like music. The rest is as important as the notes. So where there's a rest or there's a pause, somebody lives in that rest. Somebody's living in that pause. And all you got to do is ask what we have, because we only have what we have. And sometimes it's the dirt and the geography of a place. And sometimes it's some dusty old minute books. And sometimes it's some hard to read microfilm because somebody's kid got the county clerk job because their dad had it. But you read into this silence because that's where survival is.
That's so powerful. I feel like we're so trained to not look into the silence. We want the noise, right? And usually the noise comes in the form of, like you said, dusty old documents or what have you. But I do think that one of the kind of central tenets or methodological premises behind Black women's history in particular is to, as you say, lean in to that silence and to not be fearful of painting what we imagine to be in the silence, what we imagine to be there in part because of common sense and informed speculation, or whatever we want to call it. I think that's so powerful. It's one of the things that I feel has placed Black women's history in particular at the top of US history. We're sort of keeping the game moving.
I mean, to be clear, this book is also loud. I do talk. I do use silence in many ways, but it's also loud.
But we're gonna get to the loud part.
Let's get loud. Yeah,
let's get loud right now. I'm gonna quote you from a line in the beginning of the book where you say, "A gendered binary is developing within the scholarship. Enslaved men rebel, while enslaved women resist." Talk to me about that.
Yeah, I mean, I entered graduate school the same year that the much beloved Stephanie Camp published her book about women in resistance. And resistance was heavy on my mind. And her work, the kind of work that she does, has heavily influenced the kind of work that I do in this book. And so I want to speak her name here today too, and her memory here today too. And at the time that I really began researching in earnest, so many books about slave resistance and rebellion, particularly in the U.S. context. It's in the broader diaspora, things are a little bit better on this, but the tendency was to say, okay, great, her work just pointed out this everyday resistance thing, so that just must be what women did. And then over here, men are leading slave revolts, right? And so what I want to do in my own work is say, no, these are not two separate projects. Enslaved people had to be very savvy to stay alive. And folks had to choose from sort of a menu of ways to resist or not to keep breathing. Because, a slave rebellion is not a game. They all, except for one famous instance that I can think of, all ended in a lot of Black death. And so the Black women in this book who are warning other people, we got a lot of systems going here. This might not be the way to do this. They are not wrong. There were catastrophic consequences for the Black community as a result of this. So the way that I am seeing women, right, is that if men maybe are the infantry and the cavalry of this rebellion, women are the supply line and the intelligence network, and so are children. And you cannot have a successful military operation without that. You run out of food, you run out of supplies. If you don't have eyes that can tell you, and this is something I talk about women doing in the book, if you cannot say, oh no, the white enslavers, they now know this is happening. You don't have the element of surprise anymore. That's critical information to have. And that's not women being separate from, right? That's no. This is a whole community of people who are drawing from sort of a lexicon, a menu of practices, right, to help each other stay alive. And people make choices along that continuum. So it isn't really fair to just say, oh, these are separate, gendered ways of resisting slavery. No, men also hid people in their cabins. Men also went to illicit meetings and sought pleasure and some respite. Heck, this rebellion begins with a barbecue. It begins with some brandy and a barbecue. So separating those things out, right? I think what camp really was doing was trying to put these things in conversation. And so that's what I hope my work, can continue to do.
Mm-hmm. I'm glad you referenced children, and I'm gonna come back to them, because I think it's a really powerful intervention in your book. But I want you to take us to Southampton. I want you to take us there, the years leading up to the rebellion. What do we need to know? What do we know? What do people think they know? And what do people get wrong? And what do people need to know?
Most people know Nat Turner's name. It's either him or the sort of archetypal rebellious slave makes a cameo in most people's writing about the antebellum period. But even he began his confessions with his community. He actually began it with his grandmother and mother, and how they embedded in him a sense of what Dinah Remy Berry would call soul value, and how critical his community was in nurturing his particular genius. So if he starts there, that's where we really need to start. He said it, that this is the key to what I'm doing here. Southampton County it's on what is called the south side of Virginia, south of the James River. It's right on the border with North Carolina, and very close to the Great Dismal Swamp. The soil there is a rich sandy loam, and it's fairly unique because it was one of the few places in Virginia you could grow upland short staple cotton in the 1830s. And so knowing that, and having actually gotten some of that soil on my shoes and been out in the swamps and, come back with ticks and had an idea, what does this place really look like? Because a lot of the roads are actually the roads that were there in the 1830s. I began to think about what can this place tell me about these folks? And what it can tell me is that on these small to mid-size farms and plantations, women would have been incredibly mobile during their daily workday. And that's critical if you're the hub of information in your community. It is critical that we recognize that women were expected to move between field and domestic space, between kitchen and orchard, between chicken coop and tobacco field or cotton field, to really, really get it. And so what you need to know about Southampton County is that it's hot, that it's swampy, and that there's cotton there. And that will tell you everything about people's daily work days, especially in August, which is the point in the year. I say this in the book. It's a time of year where the cotton rests, but nobody else does. Enslaved people didn't get to rest, but the cotton rests, getting ready for harvest. So much of what happens in the aftermath of this rebellion, you have to understand that it was the time of reaping, that you felt it when people were missing on the gang. You felt it when people were missing in those rows, because it was all hands to get it in. So those are the things you need to know about the place. Like, what is this land? What does it feel like? What does it smell like? And the people, another historian has said this is an intimate rebellion, and that's true. A lot of the people in this book grew up with their enslavers, which adds a very different dimension. Some of the people in this book were related to their enslavers, and that adds a whole other dimension. And I think it's important to note that a number of the families that are in this book have descendants that are still there.
Yeah, that's actually leading me where let's stick with the kind of geography and the location, what it's like to do the research, right? As you say, walking through the road, because part of the research, of course, it's looking through the documentation that's available. It's the oral histories, of course, but it's also, as you say, feeling that space, right? What does it smell like? The ticks that, because in part that influences the way you tell this story, the way you write this history, but more specifically, talk to us a little bit about what it means to walk into a place or to write about a place that is so well known, right? The sort of, well, what else can we get from out of this story? But also a place where descendants walk about, and walking that line between in collaborating perhaps with descendants, and the kind of threading the needle that has to happen when you're dealing with folks whose family members, whose ancestors are directly connected to what happened.
So I've been to Southampton County a number of times over the course of working on the book, and also as a part of a couple of public history projects in the county. And this is where the sort of modern day, the sort of modern day manifestation of silence is really important. Because in the few trips that I took with some of the folks that I encountered, they would say things like, "Oh, right, the rebellion. Well, I don't know anything about that," and just were not particularly interested in talking to me. And that's fine, because the truth is, I would get back in my little car and leave at the end of the day. But they live and work in the county. Their kids go to high school together. They, my experience as an outsider and a researcher is not the same as someone who is living in the county. While working on a project to hopefully bring a virtual tour that would do a lot less of imposing on people's land to build a tour out, I got the privilege of actually being brought around the county by a descendant of Nat Turner. And I talk a little bit about Bruce Turner at the very, very end of the book. And it was from him that I really got the confirmation that I was right, that women were using this event as a warning and a caution. And here's a man who grew up in mid 20th century Southampton County, has seen a lot of history in Southside Virginia, is also an owner of land, has cousins who own the land that Nat Turner was once enslaved on, who would sit with his grandmother and ask her stories about the family. And his grandmother cautioned him not to get mixed up in some Turner mess. And that was this echo that I heard from women that I look at in my own work, that they cautioned people. And the thing is, the people who they cautioned lived until the 1930s to tell the tale, right? So they weren't wrong. They were right about being careful. So I've had a number of like really, really wonderful interactions. I've met some white descendants of families that were almost completely wiped out. In fact, one descendant, Rick Francis, is actually the county clerk now and controls the records.
Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So I cover a couple of really important women, Esther and Charlotte, in the book, who confront their enslaver in the Francis Farms kitchen. And at the moment that Lavinia Francis, who's passed out in an attic nearby and barely survived being found and murdered by, she's 8 months pregnant, she kind of waddles into the kitchen, and these two women look at her like, one of them actually says, "We thought you were dead." And one decides to grab a kitchen knife and go after her, and one holds her off. And so I use that moment to talk about the various choices that are being made in a split second. Rick Francis is a descendant of Lavinia Francis. He wouldn't exist if Esther had not held Charlotte for a couple seconds so she could escape into the swamps. And he and a few of his cousins actually have been really instrumental in making sure Nat Turner's Bible made it to the museum in Washington, D.C. He's done a lot of work to make sure the county's records are at the Library of Virginia. So there's an interesting moment with locals in the county. He's also was important to the movement to changing the road sign for Blackhead Signpost Road. The county had a road named for the site where African Americans' heads were placed on pikes after the rebellion. It's a very literal name. And just this February, actually, because of a lot of community activism over almost 10 years, because the first cry to change it, very public cry to change it, happened in 2012, was a part of switching it over to just Signpost Road. So still acknowledging the history, but being very clear that that violence wasn't going to be celebrated anymore on a green street sign. So these are the things about contemporary geography that you encounter in the county, that streets are named after prominent rebellion sites, that people drive every single day, that homes where murders occurred, some are still leaning in the middle of farmers' fields. You can still walk up to what's left of them. That the local historical society is painstakingly restoring at least one of them. It's all still there. You can stand basically where the courthouse was, and you can see from that courthouse steps where the hanging tree would have been, where the potter's field where everyone was buried would have been, and get a sense of how close everything was.
Right. And that's one of the things you do so beautifully in the book, is that we feel the kind of the tightness, right, of that community, the space, that in some ways it's constricted, and that these folks, they know one another. And I think, one of the things that we do as historians is you know, it's our job to paint these pictures, right, of our community. And I just want to pause briefly to kind of give you the opportunity to talk about, when we're talking about painting pictures, to talk a little bit about the cover of this book, which is absolutely beautiful. And as we, you know, I firmly believe that when you look at the cover of a book, it's a signal about what you're about to encounter. And I'm hoping you could talk just a little bit about the cover.
Sure. It's a really wonderful actual story of how I ended up with this as the cover. And I want to shout out the design team at University of Illinois Press, because they also carried the motif onto the back of the book, which I really appreciate. So Stephen Towns is an artist who did an amazing series of story quilts about the rebellion. And I happened to be in Baltimore for an event for Tara Hunter, another wonderful Black women's historian. And we happened up to the museum to see the quilts, and they were gorgeous. And then we had our evening event, and there was a man in the front row taking a lot of notes. And he came up to me afterwards and said, "Oh, hi, you know, I'm really excited for your book. I just did some quilts about Nat Turner." And I said, "Oh my gosh, you're the artist of this. You're Stephen Towns." So we've stayed in touch, and I'd hope to use his work in some way in for the cover of the book or in the book, because he does something that we can't do with words, and he really pulls together and layers iconography and meaning in his work to convey, right? It's the closest maybe I've ever come to seeing a visual representation of what I see when I encounter silence in the archive. So I'm going to put a link to the series that this work comes from. It's the Black Magic series. He also painted a series of paintings imagining the life and relationship between Nat Turner and his wife, Cherry Turner. And you can tell that he was trained by some Renaissance specialists from the artwork, because he really does work with the kind of really repeating motifs, like the butterflies. They show up in a lot of his work. Halos and gold foil show up in a lot of his work. But we all know that it's really important what saints are holding. And so for me, the fact that I know Cherry survived this rebellion, I know his children survived this rebellion largely because of her. It meant so much to have a really rich and lush, you know, visual depiction, right, of what I could see in the silence around his wife. We know she existed. I think we can suggest that she was part of making sure he was fed while he was hiding out for over 2 months right under his enslavers' noses. But he never mentions her name. And silence keeps people alive. So having this loud cover was something. I'm so excited that I get to use his work in this way.
Well, I love how you state that, you know, we have to look at what saints are holding, right? And so I'm looking at this baby and thinking about the way you bring children into this narrative about rebellion, about resistance, about engagement, and in a way that really hasn't been done. And I think in a moment where we are thinking about childhood studies in particular, and some of the more recent texts that have come out around sort of 19th century African American life and children, I'm wondering if you could just take a little bit of time to talk about how you center children in this moment in a way that just hasn't been done.
Mm-hmm. When I was trying to figure out what the slave patrols looked like in the counties, I could really get a sense for, well, what exactly is this community rebelling against? What are the systems in place that they're rebelling against? I had the moment in the archive that historians dream of. I opened a box of free Negro and slave records and found not just the ledgers of free people of color that I expected to find, but I found a box full of indenture papers for free Black children. And I leafed through them and photographed them. And when I got to the indenture for a 6-month-old, I realized that I wasn't going to be able to put this in the dissertation. My goddaughter had just been born and I couldn't do it. And that's a piece of this work that we do that I don't know that we really talk about, that there is an affect when it comes to handling these sources. So I put it away and I came back to it. And I looked into this really exploitative system of labor that bound out free children of color to white masters and mistresses for 18 to 21 years. It was also a system used for white children. The difference was that Black children did not get basic literacy and what they called sums, but was basic arithmetic. And as I, really, really looked into these instances of indenture, I started to see that some of them popped up in the midst of court trials in the aftermath of the rebellion. Sometimes I talk about, geography in terms of land and space or an individual farm, but the geography of the sources we use is also really key here, because minute book pages are they're large. Minute books were huge. Sometimes table-sized books. And if you only look at the parts where a trial is being read into the minute book, you get the story of that trial. But if you read the full court date, you start to see who else in the community was also at court that day. And that's where I found free people of color showing up to have their freedom read into the record, to be sure that people knew. Mm-hmm. And I find these indentures in the midst of the rebellion, or children's parents are binding them out to white people. This led me to ask the question, well, why would you do that? Which opened up for me a number of questions about enslaved children and where enslaved children would have been. And as I looked for women in sources like census records, plantation ledgers, and tax records, I realized what is sort of an obvious truth to 19th century historians, that children were everywhere and in large numbers. And some of these enslavers, maybe their holding was 25 enslaved people, but 14 of them were under the age of 10. So that really changes what the labor is that people were doing on these particular farms. And some of that labor was training children to work, because that's one way to survive slavery. Though it, of course, is arduous and dangerous in its own right. But you've also got to train children to survive. They're enslavers. I came across one farm that didn't make it in the book, that had an entire workforce of free people of color. And all but one of these about 15 free people of color were boys under the age of 10. Mm-hmm. And sometimes you encounter silence that you don't want to look further into. But I think it's important to speak it into this discussion too, that while African Americans saw our children as children and precious and valuable, the kind of value that enslavers ascribed to them ran the full gamut, and they were not protected from any of the dimensions of violence that existed under the system. So what I try to do in my children's chapter is talk about training for survival and the reasons why a handful of youth were scooped up and brought along on the rebellion route. Why might you do that? And it really is akin to training someone, training them how to pick cotton. You have to have a skill to do that. You'll cut up your hands on cotton bolls if you don't know how to do it. Training, when do you push back and when do you hide? When do you hide? You got to teach children that, because the system in and of itself does not make a lot of sense. And so you have to learn the ways that it's nonsense making is life and death. And that's something that Black parents, Black community members took seriously.
And still take seriously. And I'm looking at the time, and I know that people have questions, and so I'm going to ask one more sort of quick question, because I want to, just for the purpose of chronology, get us to this moment after the rebellion, and for you to tell us a little bit about what it means for women and children. You kind of opened with this, with the question that I asked. What does it mean for these women and children who survived the rebellion into this sort of post-emancipation era? Can you tell us a little bit about what it means for these families, but also how you connect their lives to the folks who are alive, living in the years leading up to the rebellion, and sort of take us across the arc?
Mm-hmm. So women had been really integral to a number of survival practices, some of which historians have seen as sort of spontaneous, but there could be nothing spontaneous under slavery. You had to be able, it might be a split-second judgment call, but it could not be completely spontaneous. Whether it was making sure the people who were in fact marooned in the Dismal Swamp stayed alive, whether it was handing over some cornmeal and just not asking questions about where it was disappearing to, whether it was stationing children so they could be a lookout for an event. Women are integral to all of these things at the same time that they are navigating, at least for their enslavers, some of their enslavers' most intimate spaces. They are navigating often very closely watched and supervised types of labor. So they have a type of savvy and a type of knowledge about their enslavers that is gendered because of the kind of work they're sometimes called upon to do as women. After the rebellion, the shadows of what I see of how this work continued come in the form of some of the things that WPA narrators talk about. And so for those of you out there who are not familiar, during the Great Depression, one of the government programs that existed was a program to interview and catalog the life stories of what at the time, people who at the time were called ex-slaves, but people we would say were formerly enslaved or freed people. Of course, by the 1930s, those people were mostly very, very old and were often children during their time in slavery. So really what you're reading are the memories of their older siblings and older kin, the stories that were passed to them, and their recollection of being kids. Mm-hmm. So the story that I opened with Alan Crawford talking about his grandmother surviving the rebellion, in his interview, he could still, and this man was in his 80s when he was in there, he could still recount with times exactly when slave patrols went out in Southampton County. Mm-hmm. And he didn't know to learn those without having been taught that even as a kid, he needed to know when they were going to ride out, on what day, and who was on what patrol. So I see these shadows of women's work in the survival of their descendants. The Descendants of Nat Turner in 2014, when we first were talking about a driving tour, some came forward with the information that for generations their family has curated the cave that they believe to be the place where Nat Turner hid. And that type of vernacular curation that we know our history because we've been keeping our history, because we've been preserving our historic sites, because we've been, and we is largely Black women. These are the ways that I see this kind of survival work move forward into the present.
Well, I'm going to stop us here because I know there are folks who have questions, but before we turn it over, I just want to thank you because this is a gift. It's a gift to the field. It's so important, and thrilled that we're able to have this conversation and to position this text in what is a canon of African American women's history, or history that centers the experiences of women and children. So I want to thank you for your work and for your commitment to bring this to an audience with, and this is where I'll be your hype person and say, folks, there is the link to buy the book in the chat. So even if you've purchased your own, you should purchase another copy for your mama and your grandmama and your auntie. And we're going to figure out how to get a hold of some of this merch, like the mug that Dr. Holden has sipped from. But I want to thank you for this gift, and we will turn it over to Q&A.
Thank you so much. Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming. I'll just add, ask your local library to order it so that more people can access it. Find your favorite Black-owned bookstore, your favorite locally owned bookstore, and have them order it. If this book is about community, please, please, please bring it to your communities.
All right, thank you both so much. This has been a really fantastic conversation. So our first question comes from Alexander Vogel, and they ask, I find this text to be part of a more recent development, though indirectly, of historiography on social reproduction and slavery. Do you have any thoughts on how family, interpersonal relations, and cultural developments in the 19th century South contribute to both the reproduction of slavery and the resistance to it?
So Southampton County was not untouched by the internal slave trade. Southampton County actually contributed quite a bit to planter migration into the burgeoning cotton frontier and deep South. So enslaved people in the county, particularly by 1831, were very clear that the enslavers around them had tripled down on their commitment to slavery. The kind of blip of emancipations in the county post-American Revolution, the promise was not that there was going to be less slavery. The promise was that these people fully expected to capitalize on the system. And particularly in the pieces where I'm looking at the composition of households and just how many enslaved children were part of some of these middling farmers' households, that demonstrates that they were, in fact, quite literally banking on a return on their investment. That they were not the sort of people who could have afforded to purchase a larger labor force, but they were certainly banking on growing a labor force, and also benefiting from the financial product that enslaved people were becoming. So in very, very literal, intimate ways, they were counting on enslaved people to reproduce slavery for them. Enslaved people, though, looked at their children and thought of freedom and liberation. And sometimes that freedom looked like telling them to stay up so that when they heard their mother's skirt popping, they could throw open the door, right, to model freedom practice. Sometimes it was having them underfoot in a kitchen where they were doing any number of things like shucking corn, snapping peas, hauling water, and having them overhear their parents talking about that night's meeting in the presence of their enslaver, but in code. So I think that the things that that you're gesturing towards and asking about, I just want to say that enslaved people were very savvy about what exactly was going on here. And I don't think it's an accident that Nat Turner was a father, that the men who were with him were often fathers, that they were related to people on all the farms that they visited, that this was clearly about really squashing slavery in a generational sense, because they killed everyone. When they realized they'd missed an infant at the first house, they went back and got them too, because nobody was going to grow up to sell their children away.
All right, so our next question, I'm going to sort of combine two here. So Jillian McCommons says, I love what you said about Black women as the intelligence networks. Can you speak to how this collapses or disturbs ideas of leadership, specifically male leadership in social movements and rebellion? And then on a related note, Bill asks, can you speak to the use of the language of rebellion, which centers the enslaver instead of liberation, which centers the enslaved? And how does that language and centering impact your writing, research, and approach to your subject matter?
Hi, Jillian. Thanks so much for coming today. That's a really, really good question and observation. I think that it is very attractive and helpful in certain ways to think about, one great leader who pulls together an army and is a great hero. And Nat Turner, certainly, particularly for Black people in Virginia, becomes a larger than life folk hero. And I think that that's important in and of itself. I'm not going to say that shouldn't have happened or tell you that that's not important, because it is. But even Nat Turner is very clear that he needed women's particular knowledge, particular approval and encouragement to succeed as a child and then later as an adult. And I think that when we're thinking about a community of people, knowing that women could be relied upon to pass on information was just key, that they could be, in that way, key strategists and architects in their own right. And then some of them still appear in court to testify and somehow are not on the stand themselves as defendants. I'm in awe of the ways that they were able to really deftly, walk that tightrope. So I do think that it disrupts the idea of who really were the strategists, who makes sure that a rebellion can continue and survive. And the moments where the rebellion is at its most brash and gung-ho and, sabers and pikes and guns are the moments where it falls apart, and the moments where it's dealing with the element of surprise and having a clear idea of where the enemy is are when it is most successful. As far as the language of rebellion and resistance, I think it's important to say that I don't actually think it centers enslavers. Not really. I think that it centers really the ways that Black people, and particularly the Black people that I'm looking at, are thinking of and making and fashioning new ways of living, new types of liberation and freedom. I think that it's important to call it rebellion and not liberation, because they don't actually achieve liberation in that way. They achieve liberation and freedom in other ways in the county, but not through this particular violent revolt. I also think it's important to think in terms of how they talked about it. While many enslaved people talked about it in that way, Nat Turner himself calls it a so-called rebellion, because for him, this was not merely about civil status, like enslaved or free. He had actually divine authority. He was free. This wasn't an argument. I think it's an important, I think it's an important thing to think through how we language things. I do think a lot about language in this book, but I think it's important to use the word rebellion.
Okay, so our next question comes from Ty, and he asks, so you mentioned free people were living in Virginia at the time. Was the law about leaving the state if you were free in effect at that time? Also, was being indentured / working as day laborers for whites the primary way that free Blacks survived in the state, or were there other occupations they were allowed to participate in?
So in Southampton County, yes. Working on sometimes much longer than just day-long contracts. Actually, it was much more common for it to be really a year of labor that you contracted out for, or longer, depending on what farm you were negotiating with. So what I discovered in my work on free people of color about this particular county is that Southampton actually had the third largest population of free people of color in the Commonwealth of Virginia at the time. That free people of color mostly lived embedded in white households. And so their material condition was not greatly different than enslaved people's. There was no free enclave in the county. The closest the county had to that were lands that had been sectioned off for the county's indigenous population. So there are some free people of color is actually kind of an elastic term in Virginia at the time. It also includes indigenous people, and Black and indigenous communities overlapped in very intimate ways at the time as well. So that's the closest to a free Black enclave, because there are a number of Black people there. So laboring in white households was the primary way that freed people of color survived in the county. Now, broadly in the Commonwealth, there had long been a tradition of both free and enslaved watermen in the Chesapeake Bay and the Chesapeake watershed, all through Virginia's waterways. There were many, many, many free Black skilled laborers, particularly in urban centers. So more broadly speaking, out of rural environments, there were a number of things that free people of color did. And yes, actually, there had been a series of laws that tried to expel free people of color from the state, and they actually were facing that again in the aftermath of this rebellion. It's one of the reasons they may have thought it was a good idea to get labor contracts for their children, exploitative as they were. Though the sort of sentiment in the State House in Richmond was that this is free people of color's fault, which is sort of convenient if you're trying to preserve slavery. But in reality, on the ground, free people of color occupied a really important labor niche, particularly as enslaved property only increased in value. People could not afford to own the same labor force that some of the most established families in the Commonwealth. Even they were starting to cash out and sell their enslaved labor forces further south. So free people of color were a very cheap way to supplement labor. So they filled a really important labor niche and actually served the system in important ways.
Okay, so it looks like we have time for one more, and I think this is an excellent one to end with. So Anastasia asks, what aspects of this book are you hoping historians will build on going forward? And what are the most intriguing questions that remain about communities and rebellion?
I hope that moving forward, we'll look for rebellion in the context of community, that will pay a lot more attention to what women are doing and actually come out and just call it rebellion and call it resistance. That the assumption that somehow women weren't violent and couldn't participate in violence does not actually make sense when you look at the record of what women were and weren't doing. And that we move away, that we really move away from falling into strict binaries where either enslaved people were race heroes who were championing, freedom because that looks a specific way, or, colluding with enslavers, and that we blow that up and say, no, 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 no. People are making a number of choices in a fraction of a second. And these choices are as much about survival as they are anything else. Because when you understand survival, then you'll get what happens in the era of emancipation, when Black people just start living free. Like, Fort Sumter happens, and Black people are like, oh, okay, well, this is it. Nope, we're going to walk away now. Where does that come from? Where does that nerve come? Well, because they've been very much finding ways to live free all along. The only people really surprised about that were enslavers, right? So I hope that this work really informs the way that women appear in other work about enslaved people, informs the way that we rethink community, not as just being about, proving that Black people even had a community, right? But well, what are the ins and outs of this? I talk about doing this work. It's a lot like showing up to a cocktail party where everybody knows each other, and you don't know any of them, and you kind of got to figure out who has beef by the end of the cocktail party. And it is a community. It's not perfect. People don't always get along. I opened the book with somebody's grandmother smacking Nat Turner across the face. So this book, it gets down to this nitty grittiness that we don't have, perfect rebels and and imperfect traitors. So I really hope that is something that my book can help push forward in new work.
All right, so it looks like we're about out of time. Thank you both so much for this wonderful conversation. If anyone is interested in picking up a copy of the book, they can use promo code Holden40 on the University of Illinois Press website to get 40% off. Before we close it out, Dr. Holden and Dr. Dunbar, do you have any final thoughts for us?
I'll be very fast and quick. I'm, like I said before, grateful for this book, and also really just thrilled to kind of welcome you into a larger community of Black women who've made important contributions to the field. So thank you.
And I just actually want to speak my dedication for the book out into the Zoomiverse. This book is for my gram and abuelita, my great-grandmothers. Your memory is a legacy. Your example of survival taught me to trust silence. Your life stories taught me to persevere. And so I want to honor them in this moment of joy that I'm having, because without the legacy of survival that was passed down to me, I would not have been able to write this book.
Thank you so much. And on that note, have a wonderful rest of your day, everyone. Thank you for attending our event.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. We'll see. Surviving Southampton merch coming at ya.